Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So, making the video from the old pickup truck today. I love this old truck. I paid $500 for this truck. I paid $500 for my Toyota. I paid $700 for my wife's Taurus. I don't really spend a lot of money on my vehicles. There's plenty of cars out there, and if you keep your ears and your eyes open, you can get these really good deals on vehicles. And I tell you, I would much rather buy a vehicle for $500 than to make $500 a month payments on a vehicle. Anyway, thought I'd talk a little bit about the repo market. The Federal Reserve came out stating that they will be cutting the repo facility down at the beginning of next month. I believe it was May 4th that they said that they were going to do this. And if you're not familiar with the repo market, what's going on with this repo facility is that back in September, the banks found themselves short of liquidity. They found themselves short of cash. And what these banks do is, for reserves, they can either hold treasuries or cash. Now, a lot of these banks like to hold treasuries because treasuries pay an interest rate to them. But every so often, they find themselves short of cash, and they need to come up with this cash in order to lend to each other on an overnight basis. Now, what happens there is that these big banks, at the end of the day, some of them have excess reserves and some of them are in need of reserves. The ones who have the excess reserves lend that money to the ones who are in need of reserves. That lending that they do to each other on an overnight basis is called the effective fund rate. Okay. Now, a lot of times when you hear the Fed say that we have interest rates at 0 or 0.25 or whatever it is that they have going on at the time, that's the target. That's not the actual interest rate that these banks are lending to each other. That's the target rate that they're shooting for. The effective fund rate is the rate that they actually do that at. So back in September, these banks, they found themselves short of liquidity. They were short on cash. And they started raising the interest rates until somebody was willing to give up their cash, and it shot all the way up to 10% because they found themselves completely out of cash. There was no liquidity in these banks. They were full of treasuries, but they didn't have any cash. What was happening there is that there was a corporate tax date that was due. And these corporate taxes, when they went to go pay their taxes to the Treasury, they pulled a lot of this cash out of the system and they sent it off to the Treasury. And that left these banks short of cash to lend to each other. That created a problem, and that's when the interest rates started to rise. So these treasuries that these big banks hold, there was a lot of them in their possession, basically in their reserves, because of how much deficit spending that the government is doing. Okay, so when this government starts spending a lot of, dumping a lot of money, start spending a lot of money. They aren't dumping anything. When they start spending a lot of money and they start going into debt, that's them issuing treasuries and pushing that out into the market. These big banks, they're the ones who buy it first, and then it goes out to the rest of the people. So these banks were sitting on a lot of these treasuries, but they weren't sitting on a lot of cash. That's why the Federal Reserve had to step in with their overnight repo market, and they were buying these treasuries, and they weren't really buying them. What they were doing is they would hand cash over to these banks, and in turn they were using those treasuries as collateral, and the next day they would switch it back minus a little bit of interest rate for the Federal Reserve. And this is what was establishing the effective fund rate. That was supposed to be temporary, but it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger because the amount of deficit spending that the Treasury was doing and the amount of shortfall of liquidity that these banks were having. So this created a major issue, and that's why you saw the repo markets just absolutely blow up. Then, when all this stuff started going down, the Federal Reserve stepped in with quantitative easing. This is where they were straight up buying these treasuries from the banks. Instead of doing this whole repo thing, they were just straight up, here, we'll just buy them off you and we don't have to switch them back at the end of the day or the next day. So this quantitative easing pretty much made the repo market useless. They don't even really need it anymore, except that it still exists, but they're cutting it back. And so this is what's taking place right now with the Federal Reserve. So here in a few weeks, at the end, like I said, what was it, May 4th, I think is what they said the date was, they are going to take that repo facility from 2 days or two times a day to once a day, and once a week on the long-term repo to just once every 2 weeks. Okay? So that's basically what's taking place now, is that twice a day the Federal Reserve was stepping in with this repo rate, where they would basically swap cash for treasuries They would do that twice a day. They're going to cut that down to once. And then the long term is like 30 days. Like they would, issue out cash to these banks for 30 days in exchange for the treasuries. That's going to get cut back to just once every 2 weeks. And to be honest, with the amount of quantitative easing that they're doing, I don't even really see why they even need a repo rate right now, except for, just kind of keeps the interest rates in balance, I guess. Anyway, that's what's going on with the Federal Reserve right now. If you've read the news on it, that kind of explains it. I hope everybody got that. Uneducated Economist. You guys let me know.